All right, here we go. Stage 3 of our French Revolution inquiry. This is 1792 to about 1794, and the stage that we're going to call the Radical Revolution. And also, the other thing to remember is that the word radical means extreme. So, this is when the revolution maybe goes off the rails a little bit, and we'll talk about why. So, the first event that happened in this stage is almost right after the storming of the Bastille. Right after the Bastille is taken over by the French citizens, you remember in the last stage, they parade the chief guard's head around Paris on a spear. The king starts to get really nervous about him and his family's potential fate in France. He sees the storming of the Bastille as an example of, wow, these French citizens are so furious with this monarchy that maybe they'd be willing to storm the palace we're in the way they stormed the Bastille. And what if that wasn't the chief prison guard's head on the spear? What if that was me, King Louis the 16th's head, or my wife, or our children? And that, like any father, or any husband, or any family man, that would make you nervous to think of your family being put in that situation. So what the king and the family decide to do is that one night they are going to dress up like peasants. And remember, this is before TV, this is before the internet. So most people who had seen the king before had seen him in person in Paris or at Versailles from a distance, or had seen him in fancy paintings where he was, robed in fancy cloth, wearing a wig and all sorts of things. So Louis and his wife think if they dress up like peasants, maybe they'll be able to sneak out of France before anyone recognizes who they are. So Louis and his wife, with the help of a few of the palace guards, decide one night that they're going to leave. However, when they are walking down the road out of Paris, they are recognized by a specific French citizen. This French citizen stalls them, asks them a few questions, and while stalling them is able to call the police that are loyal to the National Assembly. And when the police and the National Assembly guards get there and they realize this is the king, what they're going to do is they're going to take him back to a palace inside the middle of Paris. But now the king is going to be surrounded by guards that are loyal to the National Assembly, so that the king has no chance to escape his own kingdom. And he's essentially a prisoner in his own country. This is going to have a massive effect on France. In particular, it's going to have an effect in two countries near France that have been watching the French Revolution very carefully. These are the German kingdoms of Austria and Prussia. Prussia is a small German kingdom that will eventually be the German country that absorbs other smaller German countries and becomes Germany, which we'll learn about later in this unit. But the kings in Austria and Prussia are watching what's happening in France and the way that the people of France are treating their monarchs, and they're starting to get nervous about what this revolution might mean inside their own countries. What if the citizens of Austria or the citizens of Prussia take inspiration from what the French are doing, and they decide to imprison the Austrian monarch or the Prussian monarch inside their own palace? Or even worse, what if there is the execution of one of the kings of Austria or Prussia? So what Austria and Prussia decide to do is that together, with an alliance between them, they are going to move 50,000 troops to the border of France in their own countries. And they're going to threaten the National Assembly, which now is basically the government of France after they've locked the king in his own palace. And they're going to tell the National Assembly that if the people of France hurt their own king, the armies of Austria and Prussia, the armies of those monarchs, will invade France and will try and save the king and reestablish the monarchy. So now other countries are becoming involved in the internal drama inside France because of the fear that this revolution might spread to other monarchies and other monarchs lose their power. So what does this mean? Well, now, I want you to remember that in our previous stage, the last thing that I talked about was the National Assembly finishing the Constitution they'd promised to make at the Tennis Court Oath. And so when the National Assembly was done making the Constitution like they said that they were going to do all the way back at Versailles on the tennis court, they decided that they were going to dissolve themselves and they were going to hold new elections in France so that the people of France could elect representatives to best serve their needs in the new government under the new Constitution. So this new government that's going to be elected is going to be known as the Legislative Assembly. However, after the Legislative Assembly is elected and the different people are picked from the different parts of France to come to Paris to serve as the government, the Legislative Assembly is going to decide that the best way to deal with the Austrian and Prussian troops on the French borders is to declare war on Austria and Prussia and to kill their troops on the French border. The problem with this is at the time that the Legislative Assembly declared war on Austria and Prussia, the French army was very disorganized. It was very disorganized for a couple of reasons. The first is many of the nobles in the French army that had previously been officers and commanders had run to different countries like Austria and Prussia when the revolution began, because they worried that if the French king was being targeted, it wasn't going to be long until the French nobility was also targeted, because they were a privileged group in society that had taken advantage of the Third Estate for years and years, so they kind of saw that maybe something bad was going to happen to them in the future, and so they ran. So this new French army that the Legislative Assembly has control of has people in charge of it that have never been in charge of armies before. And so when this army goes and tries to fight against the professional armies of Austria and Prussia, many of those armies now having employed French officers to help organize those armies as they fled the old French army, the new French Republican army under the Legislative Assembly was very quickly defeated in their battles against Austria and Prussia. When news of these French military defeats came back to the citizens of Paris and the citizens of France, people started to panic and assume that this new Legislative Assembly that they just elected must be a terrible government, because look at the terrible choices they made. And so this fear of invasion, as Prussian and Austrian armies are moving through the French countryside and moving towards Paris, leads to the Legislative Assembly deciding to dissolve itself so that new elections could happen in France for new, potentially better leaders to help defend the French kingdom from the Austrian and Prussian armies. This new French government is going to be known as the National Convention. And the National Convention is filled with extreme politicians who promise a French military victory against Austria and France, and this National Convention is filled with people who plan on, quote-unquote, saving the revolution. But I want you to remember that because of the Austrian and Prussian armies that are inside France taking over French towns and defeating French armies, the people of France tended to vote for some of the most extreme politicians who promised them the most stuff. Maybe these aren't the best people that will serve in the National Convention, but these are the people that are guaranteeing success and guaranteeing to stop the fear that the average French citizen has. And that's a very powerful thing in electoral politics. And so we get these extreme politicians willing to take radical measures to have success, becoming now the new French government. So, the other thing for you to know is that one of the most extreme individuals during this whole French Revolution has just essentially taken power in France with these National Convention elections. This guy's name is Maximilien Robespierre, and we're just going to refer to him now as Robespierre. So the first thing that the National Convention under Robespierre does is they decide that they need to put the king on trial for his crimes against the people of France. So remember, the causes of the revolution right now are about 4 years old. That's about the time that we were talking about the first stage. And so King Louis is still being blamed for the economic problems of France. King Louis is still being blamed for bread prices being too high in France, the debt that the French Republic now, but the French kingdom was in. All those problems still haven't been fixed, and Robespierre thinks that one of the best ways to ensure that the revolution will continue and to be permanent is to charge the kings with crimes and then maybe get rid of the king. So under the leadership of Robespierre, King Louis XVI was put on trial, and he was found guilty of crimes against France. He was executed on January 21st, 1793, by the use of a machine called a guillotine that would quickly behead anyone that was put into it. Robespierre did this because he knew that the revolution could never go back to a monarchy if the monarch was dead. Now that Louis was dead, the Republican form of government was the only thing left, And Robespierre saw the execution of the King of Louis as a way for himself to centralize power. One of the ways that he centralized power was through the creation of an organization known as the Committee of Public Safety. The Committee of Public Safety was formed because after the execution of Louis XVI in France, which Robespierre organized, many other European kingdoms created an alliance to fight France together and to end the revolution before it could spread further. Previously, we talked about how Austria and Prussia were fighting against the French because they were worried the revolution might spread to their kingdoms. Well, now lots of other kingdoms are worried after the execution of Louis because kings are worried that their heads might get popped off their body too, like the French king. So this European alliance aimed at France, and France's earlier defeats in battle led to Robespierre deciding that he needed to implement something called the Levée en masse. The Levée en masse was basically when the government of France said that all men aged 18 to 25 had to join the French army. Now, a lot of young men in France, 18 to 25, didn't want to join the French army because they heard about how bad the French army had just gotten their butt kicked in the previous battles against Austria and Prussia. So what Robespierre had to come up with was a strategy to force those young men to go and join the army or to face a punishment at home that was so severe that there was really no other choice other than going to the army. So what he did was he implemented something called the Reign of Terror. The Reign of Terror was when the government could accuse, or anyone in France could accuse someone of being a quote-unquote counter-revolutionary, meaning that this person wanted to have a revolution to overthrow the revolution that was already happening in France. Counter-revolutionaries wanted to restore the monarchy in Robespierre's mind. And so what he did was created this system where anyone could accuse anyone else of being a counter-revolutionary. If you were accused of being a counter-revolutionary, you would be put on a quote-unquote trial, but you would not be allowed to defend yourself, meaning you couldn't speak in the trial where you were being accused of crimes, and anyone who defended you in the trial, so any witnesses that said, no, this person's not a counter-revolutionary, would face the same punishment as the accused if the accused was to be found guilty. Many of these trials in France were not fair trials. They were already decided before the person could even go up and defend themselves. This happened across France for about an entire year, where about 20,000 people were eventually executed by guillotine because they were found to be quote-unquote counter-revolutionaries. But Robespierre put this policy in place so that he had an excuse to arrest or detain or execute any of his political opponents simply by virtue of saying, well, if you're not listening to me, Robespierre, you must be a counter-revolutionary, therefore we must put you on trial and execute you because you're trying to overthrow the revolution and trying to return the king. So for Robespierre, it became a super convenient way of forcing people to do what he wanted, forcing the army of France to get larger and larger and larger. During the Reign of Terror, individuals would be accused of being a counter-revolutionary. Like I said before, these trials were used to accuse personal enemies of crimes against the revolution, but what you need to know is quickly this process went out of control. 300,000 people were accused of crimes against the revolution, and 17,000 were decapitated by guillotine. These accusations, this is important to know, cross social lines in France. Peasants, nobles, clergymen, all sorts of different groups of people were victims to the Reign of Terror in France. But imagine living in France where people were so terrified simply to speak to one another because what if the person you're speaking to reports you to the authorities for being a counter-revolutionary simply because they don't like you? The process gets so out of control that by 1794, Robespierre himself, the creator of the Reign of Terror, is actually going to be accused of being a counter-revolutionary himself, which is pretty ironic and pretty funny. At his trial, Robespierre himself is found guilty of being a counter-revolutionary, and he is executed by guillotine on July 27, 1794. This led to a famous quote, "The revolution devours its own children," because even Robespierre, who made this revolutionary tribunal, this Reign of Terror system, even he is consumed by the craziness and the out-of-control aspects of it. So now, Robespierre's dead. When Robespierre dies, we finally are going to move on to stage 4. where the new group of people, a new government of France called the Directory, will take over France for a little bit of time until this guy takes the whole thing over.